funding.
Okay, good afternoon and welcome to a Washington, D.C. Ag Update from KCoe Isom. My name is Claire Weinzerl and I'm the Communications Manager at the Illinois Soybean Association. In today's webinar, KCoe Isom's Brian Kuehl will provide an update on activities in Washington, D.C. that can affect you and your operation. The webinar will look at the latest developments on the 2023 Farm Bill, USDA carbon programs, and potential tax code changes in ag program funding that may become law this year. This 1-hour webinar will include time at the end for you to ask any questions that you may have. So please feel free to type those into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we will answer those following the presentation. Another note that today's webinar will be recorded in the event you would like to rewatch it or share it with your network. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Brian Kuehl. Brian is KCoe Isom's Director of Government and Public Affairs, and he helps KCoe clients track policy developments in Washington, D.C. and advocates on behalf of U.S. agriculture. Brian also serves as Executive Director for 2 agriculture trade associations, the Farmers for Free Trade and the Agriculture Trade Education Council. Please join me in welcoming Brian.
Thank you so much, Claire. It's great to be on, and thank you to the Illinois Soybean Association for the opportunity to talk with you today. We're going to cover a bunch of topics. I was joking with Claire before the webinar. You know, we had originally talked about potentially doing this conversation last week, and just how different the conversation is this week from last week. I mean, the world really has changed dramatically in the space of 7 days. When you think about the war in Ukraine, the sanctions, what that means in terms of fertilizer exports and natural gas prices from Russia and Belarus, and then also the State of the Union. Last night's State of the Union with President Biden, and what that, or 2 days ago, Tuesday's State of the Union, and what that tells us about their policy priorities moving forward. So I'm really pleased that we decided to hold the discussion today rather than a week earlier. I think we have a lot of additional information to share with you. We're going to cover a bunch of broad topics today. We're not going to get into great detail on a lot of these topics. This is sort of a broad overview. We certainly can dive in deeper to any of these topics in the Q&A or one-on-one afterwards. We're going to talk about some funding programs, for example, and if you want assistance with those, it's probably outside the scope of this webinar, but we can certainly do follow-up calls on any of these topics. So with that, I'm going to talk first about, if I can get this rolling, bear with me one sec. I'm going to talk first about the Build Back Better legislation. And I would caution you to not get hung up on the name Build Back Better because we don't know exactly where this is going to go. But just to refresh everyone's recollection, since the start of his term, President Biden had pushed three initiatives. He had pushed the American Rescue Plan, which Congress did pass soon after President Biden was elected into office. And that was a trillion or a $2 trillion package that included heavy emphasis on COVID and COVID response, direct funding for people who were unemployed, et cetera. The second was the American Jobs Plan, and that was focused on infrastructure. That bill, in turn, has passed, not as big as originally proposed by President Biden. He had proposed roughly a $2 trillion package. Ultimately, about half that was passed. But notably, it was passed as a bipartisan package with significant Republican support. And that package really is noteworthy because it makes truly historic investments into infrastructure in the United States, into roads, bridges, inland waterways, a lot of the ports and locks and dams along Mississippi, for example, that will get upgraded because of that infrastructure bill. Obviously, really good news for U.S. agriculture and our ability to get products to market. And then also the infrastructure bill is noteworthy because of its investment of almost $70 billion into rural broadband. Just by way of comparison, in the early 1900s, 1930s, when Congress passed the Rural Electrification Act, it put aside about $15 billion in today's dollars. So the equivalent today of about a $15 billion investment in rural electrification. And by contrast, or by comparison, the infrastructure bill that was passed is putting about $70 billion into rural broadband. So really the opportunity to bring that high fiber, high capacity fiber into every rural household, school, rural health clinic across the country will really make a difference for our rural communities and also for agriculture. Increasingly, agriculture wants to have access to the broadband internet for some of the more complex programs and programming that can be done. So those are big packages that passed and are in the process of being implemented. The third priority that President Biden had articulated was what he called the American Families Plan. And it was focused on primarily kind of the social safety net. And he had originally proposed, I think a multi-trillion dollar package that's been whittled down and negotiated back and forth. But it really got high-centered late last year. Senator Joe Manchin, in particular of West Virginia, indicated that he wouldn't support the legislation because the Senate is a 50-50 block, because Joe Manchin is a Democrat. His opposition to the Build Back Better legislation effectively killed it for 2021. Having said that, more recently, as recently as March 2nd, Senator Manchin has said he could support a package that, as long as it reforms the tax code, lowers the cost of prescription drugs, and splits the money between climate change and deficit reduction. Deficit reduction obviously also will fight inflation. That's an interesting realignment of issues because the bill has been high-centered for some months now. And the thought that the way to get it off high center might be if the Democrats coalesce around a package that has deficit reduction in it, might be a way for them to move forward. And the question then is going to be, can they get Senator Sinema on board? She's the senator from Arizona who has said, another Democratic senator said she does not want to see tax increases. But it's unclear if those tax increases are coupled with deficit reduction, whether she will change her tune. So that's one thing everyone is watching right now. Really notable that in the State of the Union on Tuesday, President Biden said he was pivoting away from Build Back Better, but his speech focused on a lot of the same priorities. So clearly he's still hoping to see things like the child tax credit, universal pre-K end up in a final package. Tellingly, though, he did really highlight the need for deficit reduction. And he talked about his desire to reduce the deficit by $1 trillion, or to reduce the debt, I guess, by $1 trillion, which would be a significant turnaround after years of seeing the debt increase in the United States. So the thought that that this package might shift to a sort of fiscal constraint package that includes deficit reduction, tax increases on wealthy individuals and wealthy and larger companies, and then some spending, whether it's on climate change or these other priorities that President Biden has articulated. Those are sort of the contours that now are on the table and that everyone is watching. Notable that President Biden again reiterated his desire that a final package not raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000 a year. So the Democrats seem to be holding to that line. Whether they actually meet it, whether when you look at the details, that's actually how it's implemented, I think is a separate question. But in terms of a rhetorical point, how they're framing up the legislation, that does give us some sense of how we might see tax code changes happen. But I think the big news really, in my mind, over the last 48 hours on this topic is, number one, the issue appears to be back on the table. I think we had anticipated going into the State of the Union that perhaps it was dead for the year. I think it appears that the Democrats have a path to try to resurrect it. I think it's a really narrow path. I think the odds are still long that they will be able to get this done, especially when you think about other priorities. For example, by March 21st, they want to turn to the hearings for the new Supreme Court nominee. So there are other things they're trying to get done. Whether they can get this package done in that context is the big question. And again, whether Senator Sinema comes on board is a big question. If this package does move, I think the things that we're going to want to keep an eye on are, number one, what are the tax increases? We want to make sure that, for example, the estate tax rates don't change, that the step up in basis doesn't come back on the table. Remember, those had all been stripped out in the earlier Build Back Better proposal. We want to make sure they stay stripped out. So one thing we at KCoe, and I'm sure Illinois Soybean will be watching closely, are those any tax code changes that could affect farmers. That'll be really important as we watch. Beyond that, there's a number of provisions we'll be tracking. The climate change provisions could impact farmers in a positive way. There would presumably be significant funding on the table, specifically for ag and climate change. And there was an ag title in Build Back Better that plussed up a number of existing farm bill programs. So we'll be watching those very closely to see if those end up in a final package and if there's actually some good stuff in there for farmers. So those are the kinds of issues that we're watching right now. In terms of tax priorities, again, some of the things that Biden has really pushed on, tackling the deficit, 15% minimum tax rate for corporations, closing tax loopholes for the very wealthy. He touted getting more than 130 countries to agree on the global minimum tax rate, the 15% minimum. And then again, he reiterated his pledge that nobody earning less than $400,000 would pay new taxes. Senator Manchin, similar positioning. He's talked about supporting a corporate tax increase to 25%, 15% minimum tax, 28% capital gains tax, elimination of tax loopholes. He's also supported some increase in the brackets for upper income individuals, higher rates for the wealthy. Again, this runs contrary to where Senator Sinema is. She has said she doesn't want to see tax increases. So that's going to be the big question: is can Manchin and Sinema get on the same page, and what will it look like if they do? But this is currently the state of negotiations. Other topics that we're tracking, farm bill discussions obviously are a very big issue for all of us. Congress, and specifically House Agriculture Committee, has begun hearings on the next farm bill, the 2023 farm bill. Those early hearings have focused on Title I commodity programs. There's not a lot of new news there. A lot of it is looking at the programs, how they've functioned to date, taking input from ag associations on what they would like to see, but not a lot of detail in terms of what we may see in terms of changes. We think it's pretty clear that one big push is going to be to try to include more climate change provisions in the 2023 Farm Bill. One of the big points, though, is who will be in power in 2023. Will the Republicans take the House of Representatives? If so, climate change will probably not be such a priority for the Farm Bill. If the Democrats hold the House, it probably will be. Same thing with the Senate. Will the Republicans hold the Senate, or will the Democrats hold the Senate after the midterm elections? A lot of unknowns. I think right now the smart money is that the Republicans are probably positioned to take the House and possibly the Senate. But a lot can happen in the next 9 months, and so these issues are obviously going to reflect that political change. Other topics that we're watching and that I'm sure are all on your radar screen, but the world has really changed in the last week with respect to U.S. sanctions, not just against Russia, but Belarus, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine went through Belarus, or at least part of the invasion. And in fact, I think there are reports that Belarus has contributed soldiers into the invasion. So significant sanctions are hitting Belarus, and specifically the Belarus Potash Company. I think there's a lot of discussion going on. Our commodities division that tracks these issues is certainly watching this to look at what could this mean for U.S. in terms of fertilizer costs, and how will the U.S. be differentially affected from, say, Brazil, which is much more dependent on fertilizer than the U.S. And imports significantly larger amounts from Russia and Belarus than we do. Will Brazil have a hard time maintaining the position that it's established over the last couple of years, in part because of the China tariffs? Brazil has been able to get a competitive foothold that they didn't have before. Will they be able to hold it with all the roiling of fertilizer markets in particular? Other topics to be aware of, the Growing Climate Solutions Act. It passed the Senate last summer on a vote of 92-8. It primarily sets up directs USDA to set up a certification program to assess carbon sequestration. The House has not passed that bill yet. It's been high-centered. One thing we're watching is, will the House take up and pass that legislation? Some Senate Republicans are encouraging the House Democrats to pass it as a standalone bill without Republican support. So kind of an interesting tension between Senate Republicans who support this bill and House Republicans, specifically on the Ag Committee, who do not like it as much. It does have 29 GOP co-sponsors, but the House Agriculture Committee ranking member, G.T. Thompson of Pennsylvania, has been dragging his feet and saying he doesn't want the bill to pass in its current form. So one of the dynamics we're watching is, will the chair of the House Ag Committee at some point just bring the bill forward without Republican support, or take it straight to the floor so it can pass? So this is one of the climate bills that we're tracking. In addition to climate legislation, you've probably seen in the news recently, USDA has launched a new Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities opportunity or grant program. Right now, USDA is accepting project applications that are due, I believe it's April 11th, I think is the deadline. And USDA is doing these programs in two tranches. The first are sort of large programs. Those are, I think, $10 million to $100 million projects. So really bigger sized projects. And what they're trying to accomplish with that, they're soliciting proposals from nonprofits, from tribes, from for-profits to create climate smart commodity programs. So those could take a number of different forms, but you could envision, for example, a state soybean association or national or corn saying that they're going to receive funds from USDA. They're going to use those funds for farmers who want to participate in a carbon sequestration effort that could take any number of forms that would be verified. USDA would give funds to that association to manage that pilot. The association in turn would then grant those funds out to its members who want to participate. So those proposals are being written right now. At KCoe, we've been involved in a number of these discussions with associations who are interested in teeing up proposals, also with for-profit companies that are going to participate. After this tranche of projects is completed, USDA will be doing a smaller set of projects, and those will be more appropriate for individual producers who might want to do a project on their farm, or for groups of producers, but they'll be much smaller scale. So this might be something you've heard about, you might even be involved in some fashion. After this large program is completed and the proposals are in, USDA then will turn to the second tranche. So that's something you're going to want to be watching for if you're interested in carbon markets and particularly how you might participate. I will just mention, and I don't have a slide on this, but another topic that we're tracking is USDA has a grant program that's open right now on meat processing, meat and poultry processing, and same kind of framework. They're soliciting large proposals right now. Those are due, I think, April 7th. And those are up to $25 million grants to diversify meat and poultry processing. And then after those grants are done, this summer, USDA will roll out another program, $235 million program, and that will focus on smaller projects in the meat and poultry processing space. In addition, USDA has rolled out a loan guarantee program, a $1 billion loan guarantee program for meat and poultry processing and for diversifying food supply chains generally. So that's sort of everything past the producer level and short of the grocery store level. So if you're involved in any processing, whether that's meat and poultry, or in the case of the loan guarantee program, processing outside of protein, those are things you're going to want to be aware of and taking a look at. And again, if you have questions, we're happy to answer those and can talk either on this webinar or one-on-one later. Other legislation not super likely to move anytime soon, but just to be aware of in terms of a national discussion. Senator Jon Tester recently introduced his Agriculture Right to Repair Act. Obviously, that creates a little bit of tension between equipment manufacturers and equipment dealers versus producers who want to be able to repair their tractors. But Jon Tester of Montana stepping into that discussion with a new bill. Let me pause there and open it back up to Claire. If you have questions or want to dive into particular topics, I'm happy to dive into greater detail or whatever you would like at this point.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian, for all those insights. We're going to go ahead and begin taking questions from the audience. So if you have one, please go ahead and type it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we will go ahead and go through those. Currently, we don't have any. So Brian, we can give it another minute and see if any roll in.
Great. And Claire, are there any topics that are on your mind or Illinois soybean? Is Illinois soybean or is American soybean doing anything with the Climate Smart Commodities program? Do you know?
I am not the one to ask on that question.
Right. Probably throw you a curveball. You're like, what the heck? I wasn't thinking that.
I'm strictly here to moderate.
All right. Fair enough.
Give it another second here.
I will say on the Climate Smart Commodity Program, there is a USDA webinar going on at this very moment that my assistant Brad Mormon is on. So I keep expecting he'll come in here with a note of some breaking news, but so far he is not. But new developments on these fronts virtually every week. And you may recall on our last webinar, a lot of this stuff is stuff we knew was coming. So we talked about on our last webinar that we knew USDA would be stepping heavily into the climate space using authorities of the Commodity Credit Corporation. That's certainly what they are doing. And I think there are a lot of opportunities that people should be aware of. And I think even if you're not yourself applying for one of these grants, you're going to see the effect of these programs as associations and businesses. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if Cargill or others are going to be rolling out climate smart commodity programs using this USDA funding. So I think it's something that our industry is going to be seeing develop, whether we're actively participating in it or not.
Okay, we did just get one question in from the audience. It says, are applications now being accepted for the meat and poultry processors grant and loan guarantee programs?
They are. So those applications are due April 7th. And they are for new or expanded facilities. And they really are targeting kind of shovel-ready facilities. So they want you to be very far along the development path, to the point of having costing of the new facility completed, an idea of who your key personnel will be and having their resumes. So you need to be pretty far along to participate in this round of funding. This funding is for grants up to $25 million in size. So you could, feasibly build a whole plant with that funding. But the funding is capped at 20% of your total project cost. So even though you could build a plant with 25 million, you couldn't do it. You can only get 20% of your project costs from this grant program. USDA has indicated they have $150 million for this round. They expect to select 15-ish projects. So 15 to 20, I would think, would probably be on the table. So assume that they're going to be selecting relatively larger projects. If you're talking $10 million projects, those are going to be very significant facilities that they're looking to fund. But again, they will be doing a second tranche this summer, which will be a much larger pool of funding, 235 million. And that funding will be for smaller projects. So I would expect those will be everything from, $20,000 to multiple millions of dollars in size. So depending on what your interest is, it's either something you should be working on immediately if you want to meet that April 7th deadline, or something that you should be looking at for this summer.
Okay, thank you. Another question in here says, how do you expect the balance to take relative ratios between what is increasingly a food bill and the traditional perspective on a farm bill in emphasis in this Congress and this administration?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you for that, Scott. Very much appreciated. Yeah, this is a really interesting dynamic that came up in the last farm bill, and I'm sure we will see again. Many farm bills ago, the decision was made to bridge urban constituencies who are primarily interested in the nutrition assistance programs with rural constituencies primarily interested in the commodities programs. And politically, that makes a lot of sense. If you want to get a bill through Congress, even though rural areas in our constitutional framework have disproportionate power, I mean that in the US Senate, each state gets 2 senators, whether it's an urban state or a rural state. So rural areas have more power in the Senate, and rural areas have more power in the Electoral College. So in terms of selecting a president, the rural areas have disproportionate power. But even with that power, it's unclear whether we could just pass a farm bill every 6 years or every 4 years if it was just focused on farms. You could imagine that urban constituencies in the House would say, well, what's in it for us? So the answer to that question has been, well, what's in it for you are the nutrition programs, the food stamps, those types of programs. And that was the political calculus, which has worked fairly well. There have been efforts in past years to try to split those apart. Those 2 programs have stayed together. I would expect they will stay together for this coming 2023 Farm Bill. I do think the Democrats will probably place a much bigger emphasis on nutrition programs as part of the upcoming Farm Bill. And in some respects, farm bills are always a little bit of a zero-sum game. You only have so much money to spend. And so relative allocation between the different titles is one of the things that we watch very closely. This year, I think one of the interesting dynamics is this Build Back Better legislation that we talked about. And the reason that's an interesting dynamic is because, as I mentioned, it has an ag title, and that ag title would put funding into ag programs. Now, those would be largely tied to climate and other topics. But if you think about the Farm Bill being zero sum, that it's a set amount of money that's allocated, to the extent that Congress funds a lot of those programs early through through something like the Build Back Better legislation, it may make it easier to get a completed farm bill because some of those programs have already been funded. So there may not be as much of a fight when it comes to actually getting the farm bill funding. So that is one topic we're going to watch over the next year. I will mention one other quick note. KCoe Isom, we have launched a coalition, an ad hoc coalition that we're calling the Farm Program Fairness Coalition. And you can find that online at farmprogramfairness.com. And this coalition is for farmers who want to participate in the Farm Bill lobby effort over the next 2 years. We'll be looking at things like payment limitations will be one of the big focuses of the Farm Program Fairness Coalition. We'll also be looking at carbon programs and other topics, and then probably administrative topics as well. For example, audit reform. Audits can be such a headache for farm program recipients, and really people have to jump through a lot of unnecessary hoops. I'm sure a lot of you have been doing that just in the last couple months. So take a look at farmprogramfairness.com if that's of interest, and we can certainly talk more about that as well.
All right, well, we still have plenty of minutes left for questions. So if you have any, go ahead and shoot them in the chat or the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom window. While we wait for any last minute questions to roll in, I would like to let the audience know that in our partnership this year, KCoe Isom has provided tons of great tax resources for us that can be found at www.ilsoy.org/tax resources. So be sure to check those out, and of course, stay tuned for future webinar opportunities. Doesn't look like we have any other questions. So I'd like to thank Brian today. Thank you for your presentation and for giving us an update on what's going on with ag in DC.
Well, and thank you so much. And thank you really to Illinois Soybean for all the good work that you do. You're really a leading voice for agriculture in Illinois and nationally. And these issues are so important that I can't imagine doing the work that we all do without the support of organizations like yours. So thank you.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all for attending. We hope you have a great rest of your day.
Take care.